My name is Daniel Mercer. I am 42 years old, and for most of my life, I was the quiet one in the room. Not the type people point to at family gatherings or office parties. Not the one with loud opinions or endless stories. I had built my life on steady consistency, working as a project manager for a mid-sized firm, caring for my aging mother, and believing that loyalty was enough to earn a place in people's lives. But loyalty, I would later learn, means nothing to those who see you as invisible. It started at my own dinner table of all places. My family was gathered, a rare occasion, with laughter circling the room like smoke from a fire. I had barely spoken when my brother smirked across the table and said, "Honestly, we forget you exist half the time." Everyone laughed, everyone but me. My mother followed, her voice sharp and careless. "You are a nobody, Daniel. Don't pretend you matter." The words landed not like daggers, but like stones, heavy, suffocating, pressing me deeper into silence. I clinked my fork gently against my glass, my heart oddly calm, and said, "This won't take long, just 3 sentences." In that instant the air shifted, though they didn't notice. They thought it was just me, harmless, quiet Daniel, about to defend myself weakly, but I wasn't defending myself. I was marking the moment. By the second sentence, my mother's face had gone pale, though I spoke softly, steadily, without raising my voice. By the third, the room was frozen, and for the first time in years, I realized I wasn't the weak one at that table. They were. My betrayal wasn't the classic kind, the one that comes from enemies or strangers. It came from people who were supposed to see me, supposed to know me, supposed to hold me up, and yet the people I gave years of devotion to had reduced me to a shadow in my own story. That night, as the dishes clattered and the forced laughter returned, I sat quietly, not with anger, but with a strange kind of clarity. Betrayal, I realized, doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers in the way people dismiss you, erase you, pretend you are less than you are. I had a choice that night. I could have exploded, demanded apologies, and left the table with some dramatic scene, but I didn't. I stayed still. I listened. I memorized every word, every smirk, every sideways glance, because silence, I knew, was sharper than shouting, and planning would serve me better than rage. Revenge, for me, would not be about cruelty. It would be about balance. It would be about letting them taste the emptiness they had tried to force upon me. So I sat there, smiling faintly, nodding as if nothing had pierced me. But inside, I began to map a path of silence, patience, and quiet power. They thought they had diminished me that night, reduced me to nothing, but what they really did was wake me up, and that awakening, though they couldn't see it yet, was the beginning of their unraveling and my redemption. In the days that followed that dinner, I carried their words with me like stones in my pocket, heavy but impossible to ignore. At first I replayed the moment, asking myself if I had done something to deserve their ridicule. Had my silence over the years made me invisible? Had my loyalty to family obligations, my tendency to avoid conflict, painted me as unimportant? But the more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't about me. It was about them. People who cannot see the value in consistency, who mock quiet strength, are often the ones most afraid of being confronted by their own emptiness. I began to notice the signs I had missed all along. Little dismissals layered over time, like dust settling on a surface no one cares to clean. My brother never asked about my work, though I always asked about his. My mother only called when she needed errands done or bills handled, never to simply hear my voice. Even my cousins, those who once leaned on me during their own crises, treated me like a placeholder, someone reliable but easily overlooked. These weren't isolated moments. They were patterns, and patterns tell you more about people than any single betrayal ever could. At work, I started to see the same story unfolding. Younger employees dismissed me as outdated, while managers relied on me to quietly hold projects together without recognition. My name was rarely spoken in meetings, even when the results on the table were my doing. They used my steadiness as camouflage for their lack of competence, and I let them believing that humility was noble. But humility, without acknowledgement, becomes exploitation. That truth sank deep into me, reshaping the way I saw not just my family but every corner of my life. It hurt, not in the way an open wound hurts, but in the dull, relentless ache of a bruise that never fully heals. I thought about all the birthdays I had remembered for others, the favors I had done quietly, the sacrifices I made without ever asking for recognition, and I wondered, what does it mean when loyalty is given, but never returned? Was I truly invisible, or had I simply allowed myself to be unseen because it was easier than demanding respect? These questions haunted me, but they also sharpened me. They gave me clarity, like a blade being honed in fire. I found myself withdrawing, not out of bitterness, but out of quiet observation. I stopped volunteering for everything. I stopped rushing to answer the phone every time my mother called. I let my brother's messages sit unread, his requests unanswered. It was not revenge yet. It was distance. And in that distance, I began to see how dependent they all were on the person they claimed didn't matter. Their lives, their routines, their small comforts, they were built on the foundation of my unnoticed efforts. And when that foundation began to shift, even slightly, cracks started to appear. But I stayed calm. I did not gloat. I did not lash out. I did not explain myself. Instead, I watched. Like someone studying a storm on the horizon, I took note of how quickly they grew unsettled without my quiet presence to steady them. They didn't yet realize it, but their betrayal had set in motion something far greater than they imagined. Because while they were laughing at my silence, I was learning how powerful silence could be. It was during this period of withdrawal that I began to see opportunities forming, almost like cracks of light seeping into a dark room. My silence gave me perspective. Without the constant noise of serving everyone else, I could finally look closely at where their dependence on me truly lay. My mother, for all her sharp words, leaned on me for every piece of financial organization. My brother, for all his mocking confidence, owed me more than one unspoken favor that no one else knew about. And at work, the very people who pretended I was replaceable built their stability on the quiet certainty of my knowledge. None of them realized how much power I actually held. I started keeping records, not in the dramatic sense of dossiers or secret files, but in small, methodical ways. Emails at work that proved where credit should have gone. Bank statements showing how many times I had rescued my mother from debt she pretended didn't exist. Old messages from my brother, asking me to cover for him when his lies began to unravel. I wasn't collecting these things for blackmail or confrontation. I was collecting them for myself, to remind me that I wasn't invisible, that I had always been holding the threads together, and threads, when pulled carefully, can unravel entire tapestries. The more I looked, the more leverage I discovered. Not leverage in the sense of destruction, but leverage in the sense of balance. These people had thrived on my silence because they assumed silence meant weakness. But silence, when intentional, is strength. They didn't know I had memorized their patterns. They didn't realize that I could predict their behaviors better than they could themselves. And in that knowledge, I found a strange kind of comfort. My revenge would never be loud. It would never need to be. It would simply be a withdrawal of the stability they had mistaken for insignificance. At work, I began to quietly remove myself from the invisible roles I had been playing. I documented everything, trained no one, and allowed small failures to surface. When managers asked why certain projects were faltering, I calmly pointed to where responsibility truly lay. No anger, no outbursts, just the facts, laid out like stones on a path. It didn't take long before they realized that the outdated employee they had dismissed was the one they couldn't afford to lose. Watching their confidence shrink was not gratifying in a cruel way. It was clarifying. For once, the truth was undeniable, and it spoke louder than I ever had to. At home, my silence grew heavier. My mother's calls multiplied, each one tinged with more urgency than the last. Bills were piling up, and she didn't know how to handle them. My brother's bravado started to crack as he stumbled in his own messes, realizing I wasn't stepping in to clean them anymore. They didn't apologize. They didn't acknowledge what they had said at that dinner table. But their dependence revealed itself in ways they couldn't hide. And that was enough for me. It showed me that my existence wasn't forgettable. It was vital. They just never wanted to admit it. I remember sitting alone one evening, a notebook open in front of me, mapping out nothing more than patterns. Who leaned on me when, where their lives began to stumble without me. I wasn't plotting cruelty. I was observing balance. They had taken me for granted, dismissed me as nothing. My quiet plan was simply to show them the truth they had tried so hard to bury, that I mattered more than they ever dared to admit. And by the time they realized it, they would already be caught in the weight of their own neglect. The unraveling began so quietly that they didn't notice it at first. At work, a project I had long managed behind the scenes started to wobble. Deadlines slipped, small errors multiplied, and for the first time, the managers couldn't lean on me to fix everything at the last second. I still did my job, but only the job that was mine, not theirs. When they tried to pin the chaos on me, I calmly opened my folder of records, timelines, email threads, proof of responsibility. The room grew quiet as they saw line by line how much I had been carrying for years. My silence had transformed into undeniable evidence. It wasn't anger they faced, it was truth, and truth, presented without emotion, is harder to fight than any raised voice. My mother was next to feel the shift. She called late one evening, her voice trembling under the weight of bills she could no longer juggle. For years, I had managed her finances in silence, solving her mistakes before they grew into crises. This time, I listened. I let her speak, let her stumble over excuses, let the fear seep into her words. And then I said only this: "You told me I was a nobody. Nobodies don't fix everything." I didn't shout, didn't scold. I simply set down the truth, as calmly as a judge delivers a verdict. She went silent. For the first time in my life, my mother had nothing to say. My brother's mask began to crack soon after. A colleague of his called me by mistake, assuming I was still covering for him as I had so many times before. But I wasn't. I let his lies unravel in their own time, like a rope fraying under strain. When he confronted me, demanding why I hadn't stepped in, I looked at him with steady eyes and said, "You forgot I existed, remember that." He laughed nervously, trying to brush it off, but I could see the panic behind his smirk. Without my quiet hand steadying his life, he was exposed. The more they struggled, the calmer I became. Their chaos didn't ignite anger in me, it soothed me, because it wasn't my chaos anymore. I had carried their weight for so long that I had forgotten what it felt like to stand tall under only my own burdens. Watching them stumble wasn't satisfying in a cruel sense. It was liberating. It proved, without a word of argument, that I had always mattered. They needed me, not the other way around. And now, without my invisible scaffolding, their facades began to collapse. Even in their desperation, they tried to cling to old patterns. My mother left me guilt-ridden voicemails. My brother made jokes at my expense in front of others, as if mocking me would pull me back into service. But the words no longer had power. They were tools of a system I had already stepped outside of. I didn't need to defend myself anymore. The evidence of their unraveling spoke louder than any rebuttal could. Silence had become my greatest weapon, and patience my sharpest blade. And as I watched them falter at work, at home, in their own carefully constructed illusions, I felt something I hadn't in years: control. Not control over others in the sense of domination, but control over myself. They could no longer write me out of the story, no longer dismiss me as invisible, because their own actions, their own failures, were painting the truth across every corner of their lives. And that truth was simple: without me they were weaker, and without them I was finally free. Their collapse didn't arrive like a storm. It came like winter, slow, steady, and impossible to ignore. At work, the same managers who once brushed me aside now stumbled openly in meetings, exposed without the safety net I had provided for years. Their mistakes were no longer hidden in my silence. Deadlines failed, clients grew impatient, and I watched as the ones who once called me outdated now turned desperate for my guidance. But I didn't rush in this time. I let them feel the chill of their own arrogance, and when they finally approached me, humbled, I offered only professionalism, measured, restrained, stripped of the loyalty they had squandered. My revenge was not loud. It was the quiet absence of the man they had taken for granted. At home, the echoes of silence became unbearable for them. My mother's calls went from demanding to pleading. The same woman who once told me I was a nobody now spoke in trembling tones, asking when I could come by, asking for help she had never admitted to needing before. I could hear the fear in her voice, the realization that the stability she mocked had been her foundation all along. I didn't shout, I didn't lecture. I simply gave her space to feel the weight of her own words. Every unpaid bill, every unanswered call, it all spoke louder than I ever could. My brother, once so smug in his dismissal of me, began unraveling fastest of all. Lies he thought I would cover spilled into the open. His colleagues, his friends, even his own pride, all of it frayed until he had no shield left. He called me one night, his voice sharp, demanding, angry. He wanted to know why I hadn't been there for him. I let the silence stretch, then said quietly, "You forgot me until you needed me. That won't work anymore." He hung up, but the desperation in his tone lingered. For once he was the one left standing in the shadows, not me. The justice, I felt, wasn't the kind Hollywood would script. There was no grand confrontation, no explosive climax. It was quieter, more powerful than that. It was watching them stumble in the emptiness they had built around me. It was seeing the cracks in their voices, the unease in their eyes, the hesitation in their words. They were finally forced to recognize what I had always known. My absence was not emptiness. It was the proof of how much space I had filled in their lives. In those moments, I didn't feel anger. I felt clarity. For years, I had believed that love and loyalty meant giving endlessly, without expectation. But betrayal taught me something different. Loyalty without respect is not love, it's servitude. And I was no one's servant anymore. My revenge was never about destroying them. It was about reclaiming myself. And in their collapse, I saw my reflection, not as the invisible man they painted me to be, but as someone who had been holding power all along. The beauty of it all was that I never needed to confront them directly. I never needed to shout, accuse, or demand apologies. Life had become my witness, silence my ally, and time my executioner. They were left with the ruins of their own neglect, and I walked away carrying nothing but peace. For the first time, I wasn't invisible. I was undeniable. Peace did not come to me all at once. It came in fragments, in small moments when I realized I no longer carried their voices in my head. I noticed it one morning while drinking coffee, the sun pouring through the blinds. My mother's words, "You are a nobody," no longer stung. They were just echoes now, faint and powerless. I noticed it at work, when I entered a meeting room and didn't feel the need to brace myself for dismissal. I noticed it with my brother when his number lit up my phone and I felt nothing. No dread, no longing, no anger, just silence. Closure is a strange thing. People expect it to come from others, from apologies, from reconciliations that make sense of the hurt. But mine didn't come that way. It came from within, from realizing that I no longer needed their acknowledgement to feel whole. Their collapse was proof enough, but it wasn't what healed me. What healed me was the choice to no longer define myself by the way they treated me. I had been invisible to them, yes, but I had never been invisible to myself. I started to rebuild. Not a new life, but a new way of living, the one I already had. I set boundaries that once would have felt impossible. At work, I accepted only the responsibilities that were mine, nothing more. At home, I let calls go unanswered if they came with the old tone of entitlement. I stopped volunteering for every family event, every task, every invisible sacrifice. And in that space, I discovered a freedom I had never tasted. Oddly, my revenge had never felt vengeful. It had felt balanced, necessary. But now I didn't even need to think of it as revenge. It had transformed into something larger, redemption. I hadn't destroyed them, nor had I needed to. I had simply let them face themselves, and in doing so, I had freed myself. That freedom was more powerful than any apology they could have given me. Sometimes I wonder if they even understand what happened. If they lie awake at night, thinking of the dinner table where it all began. If they realize that their laughter and their words had marked the moment I stopped being their servant and started being myself. Perhaps they do, perhaps they don't. It doesn't matter. My silence speaks for me. And so I live lighter now, not loud, not triumphant, but steady, finally steady for myself, not for everyone else. The redemption I found wasn't about teaching them a lesson. It was about learning my own. That respect begins where silence is no longer submission, but strength, and I had found that strength. At last, at work, the silence I had built around myself began to ripple outward in unexpected ways. Without my invisible labor propping them up, the managers who once dismissed me now found themselves struggling openly. Meetings that used to glide past, on the strength of my uncredited preparation, now ended with awkward pauses and incomplete answers. It wasn't that I had sabotaged anything. I hadn't. I simply stopped saving them from their own incompetence, and in that vacuum, the truth of their weakness revealed itself to everyone else. It was subtle at first. A client asked a question, and no one in leadership knew the answer. I sat still, hands folded, watching the panic spread across their faces. When they finally turned to me, desperate, I answered calmly, factually, without embellishment. I didn't gloat, didn't smirk. I simply spoke as though I had always belonged at the center of the conversation. And in that moment, I realized I had. They just hadn't wanted to admit it. Soon after, I noticed a shift in how people addressed me. Colleagues who once overlooked me now came directly to my desk, asking for clarity, seeking my insight. They no longer treated me as the man in the background. They saw me as the one holding the knowledge they all depended on. And the managers, they softened around me. Their tones grew cautious, differential even, as if afraid to lose the fragile balance I had allowed them to keep for so long. I didn't need to punish them. Life was doing that for me. But even in their quiet desperation, I didn't rush to seize control. Power gained too quickly can burn just as easily. Instead, I maintained the same calm distance that had carried me this far. I did my work, did it well, and said little else. The less I spoke, the more weight my words carried when I finally did. Silence, once my curse, had become my crown. One afternoon, I overheard two colleagues whispering after a meeting. "It's strange," one said. "I think he's the only one keeping this place together." The other replied, "Funny, they used to call him outdated. Now he's the one they're afraid to lose." I walked past without acknowledging, but inside, something settled in me, a sense of justice that required no announcement, no declaration. They were seeing me now not because I demanded it, but because the truth had made itself undeniable. And so, while others scrambled to rebuild their crumbling authority, I rose without lifting a finger, not with titles or promotions, not with applause or awards, but with quiet recognition that came from simply letting the truth breathe. I didn't need to be loud to matter. I never had. But now, at last, they knew it too. The first true crack in my mother's armor came late one evening. She called, her voice sharp at first, the same tone she had always used when demanding something of me. But beneath the sharpness, I heard it, a tremor, a hesitation she couldn't hide. Her words stumbled over themselves as she spoke about overdue bills, misplaced paperwork, and the fear of losing control over things she had never truly managed herself. For years, I had been the invisible net beneath her, catching her before she fell. But now, with my silence stretched between us, she was falling, and she knew it. I let her speak until the room around me was quiet, until her voice cracked under the weight of her own need. Then, for the first time in my life, I answered her not as a son desperate for approval, but as a man who no longer required her recognition. "You always told me I was a nobody," I said softly, "but it seems your world only worked because of me." I didn't raise my voice, didn't lash out. My words landed gently, but they carried a weight she couldn't laugh away. There was silence on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that only comes when truth finally pierces denial. Days passed, and her calls shifted from demanding to pleading. She left messages filled with apologies disguised as questions, her voice uncertain, fragile. "Daniel, maybe I was too harsh that night. You know I don't always mean what I say. Can you come by this weekend? We need to talk." I listened to each message one by one, but I didn't respond immediately. For once I allowed her to sit in the space she had carved, the space where my presence, once dismissed, was now painfully absent. When I finally did visit, I found her surrounded by unopened envelopes, her face pale and drawn. The sharp, dismissive woman I had grown up with looked smaller now, not physically but in presence. She tried to greet me with her usual strength, but her eyes betrayed her. They carried something I had never seen before: recognition. She knew, without my needing to explain, that the balance between us had shifted. I wasn't the invisible son anymore. I was the one holding the ground beneath her feet. I didn't gloat. I didn't remind her of every cruel word she had spoken. Instead, I sat across from her at the table, the same table where she had once told me I was nothing, and I began sorting through her bills in silence. She watched me, her hands trembling slightly, as if unsure whether to thank me or apologize. She did neither. But the silence between us was no longer her weapon. It was mine. And in that silence, she understood something words could never express. She needed me far more than I had ever needed her. That evening, as I left her house, I felt no triumph, no bitterness, just clarity. Betrayal had begun at that very table years ago, but now redemption had circled back to the same place. And while she might never say the words I once longed to hear, her silence told me enough. She finally saw me, and that was all I needed. My brother's unraveling didn't come from a single dramatic event. It came like a slow leak, one lie after another slipping into the open, until there was nothing left for him to hide behind. For years I had been the quiet one, cleaning up his messes, signing forms he forgot, covering stories when his recklessness caught up to him, smoothing over his sharp edges with family and colleagues alike. He believed his image of charm and confidence was his own creation. In truth, it had been my silence holding the seams together, and now, with that silence withdrawn, the seams split wide open. The first sign came through mutual acquaintances. A friend of his, once fiercely loyal, called me one evening, his voice laced with irritation. "Your brother promised us results he couldn't deliver," he said. "We kept waiting, but nothing ever came. He said you'd been the one slowing things down." I remember leaning back in my chair, letting the words wash over me. I didn't defend myself, didn't offer excuses. I simply told the truth. I haven't worked with him for months. The friend went quiet. In that silence, another crack formed in the mask my brother had worn for so long. Soon, whispers began to circle around him. Stories that once made him look bold and successful now carried undertones of doubt. People noticed the inconsistencies, the exaggerations, the gaps in his tales. Without me to quietly correct the narrative, the truth spilled out like water through broken glass. At family gatherings, I could see the shift in eyes that once turned to him with admiration. They flickered now with suspicion, disappointment. The golden sun was tarnishing, and no one could polish him back up. One evening he confronted me directly. His voice was sharp, almost frantic, as he demanded to know why I hadn't been there for him. "You're letting people believe things that aren't true," he said, his words trembling with anger. I looked at him calmly, the way one looks at a man still clinging to a sinking raft. "I'm not letting them believe anything," I answered. "They're just seeing what's always been there." His face flushed with rage, but beneath it I saw fear, the fear of a man who realizes too late that his scaffolding has been pulled away. The real collapse came at his workplace. A project he had overpromised and underdelivered on fell apart spectacularly, leaving his superiors embarrassed and his peers furious. In the fallout, I received a message from one of his colleagues. "We should have listened when you stepped back. Now we understand." I read the message twice, then set it down. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. His downfall spoke for itself. What struck me most was how quiet it all felt. There was no shouting match, no confrontation, no grand revelation, just the steady exposure of truth he had worked so hard to cover. And as I watched from the sidelines, I felt no urge to intervene. His collapse was not my vengeance, it was simply the absence of my protection. In losing me, he had finally met himself. Success, when it finally came to me, arrived quietly, so quietly that I almost didn't recognize it at first. There was no announcement, no sudden promotion, no applause. It came in the form of an email, a short invitation to a closed-door meeting that only a handful of people had been asked to attend. At first I assumed it was a mistake. For years I had been overlooked, dismissed as the background presence, but when I stepped into that room, I realized this was no accident. They had noticed me all along, just not in the way I expected. The meeting was different from anything I had known. It wasn't about patching holes or scrambling to meet deadlines. It was about shaping direction, about long-term vision. And for the first time, they turned to me not as a fixer, but as a thinker. They asked for my insight directly, listened when I spoke, and wrote down my words as though they mattered. I spoke sparingly, as I always had, but each sentence carried weight. I saw it in their faces, the recognition that the quiet man they had underestimated had been carrying the answers all along. From that day, things shifted. I wasn't promoted in title, but something more valuable happened. I became indispensable. My perspective was sought in decisions that stretched far beyond my formal role. When contracts needed review, my judgment was requested. When disputes arose, I was the one they trusted to mediate. And in that steady climb, I felt a satisfaction deeper than any recognition my family had ever withheld from me. I was finally being valued, not for what I silently repaired, but for what I truly knew. I didn't boast about it. I didn't share the details with my family, didn't use it as ammunition against my brother's failures or my mother's dependence. This success wasn't for them. It was mine alone. It felt sacred, untouchable, a private redemption earned, not through shouting or spectacle, but through years of quiet endurance. I carried it like a secret flame, letting it warm me without needing to show the fire to anyone else. The strangest part was how natural it felt. There was no sense of shock, no disbelief. It was as though I had been preparing for this all along, as though every dismissal, every insult, every invisible burden had been shaping me for this moment. Their betrayal had not broken me. It had tempered me, sharpened me into someone they could no longer afford to overlook. My silence had been my exile once, but now it was my greatest asset. As I left one of those meetings late one evening, walking alone through the quiet corridors, I thought about that night at the dinner table. "You are a nobody," my mother had said, and now, years later, I realized the irony. By making me invisible, they had forced me to build a strength that could never be denied. My success wasn't loud, but it was real, and in its quiet certainty, I found something my family had never given me: respect. Family gatherings became something entirely new, though no one announced it. The tension that had always lurked beneath the surface now had form, shape, and weight. Conversations that once revolved around my brother's jokes or my mother's sharp critiques now felt strained. Their eyes searched mine, sometimes for approval, sometimes for validation, and each glance carried an unspoken acknowledgement. I was no longer invisible. I didn't need to speak to make them notice. My presence alone had shifted the balance, and they knew it. The table that had once been a theater of my dismissal became a quiet arena of observation. My mother spoke less, weighing her words carefully, as if afraid to undo the fragile equilibrium she now sensed. My brother attempted his usual bravado, but it faltered, hesitated, cracked under the weight of his own unraveling reputation. Each gesture, each word, now bore scrutiny from the people who had always relied on my silent strength, and in their careful calculations I saw not malice, but recognition, and perhaps a begrudging respect. I never corrected them or reminded them of the past. That was unnecessary. The truth had already revealed itself through their discomfort. They were navigating their own insecurities while I simply existed in the space I had earned. When laughter returned to these gatherings, it was no longer at my expense. It was tentative, thoughtful, a reflection of acknowledgement rather than mockery. And in that subtle shift, I felt a quiet victory deeper than any overt triumph could have given me. Even my brother, once brash and careless, began to measure his actions. He spoke less impulsively, hesitated before claiming authority, and for the first time, sought advice quietly, rather than attempting to assert dominance. I observed without interference, letting his small adjustments unfold. The lesson was no longer mine to enforce. It was simply his to learn, and as I watched, I realized the most effective form of revenge is not humiliation, but the silent revelation of truth. The gatherings themselves became mirrors reflecting the changed dynamics. People started to notice patterns they had ignored before. Friends and relatives commented subtly on how much I had always contributed, on the balance I had quietly maintained. And though they didn't say it outright to my family, I could sense their understanding forming in glances, in whispered remarks, in the recognition that the one they had overlooked had quietly held the threads of connection together. By the end of that season, I was no longer the background figure, the one who could be erased or forgotten. I had become, in the simplest terms, essential. Not because I demanded it, not because I sought revenge in the traditional sense, but because truth has a way of asserting itself without force. I didn't need applause or confrontation. I needed only to exist as I had always been, strong, steady, and unseen no longer. Alone in the quiet of my apartment one evening, I allowed myself to reflect on everything that had transpired: betrayal, silence, patience, collapse, and eventual recognition. All of it formed a narrative that belonged solely to me. For years, I had carried the weight of others' dismissals, their careless words, their assumptions that I didn't matter. And now, as I sat in stillness, I realized how much that weight had shaped me. It had honed my patience, sharpened my awareness, and forced me to cultivate a resilience that no one could take away. I thought of my mother, and the strange relief in knowing she had begun to recognize me, not as the invisible son, but as a man with boundaries, insight, and strength. I didn't need her gratitude to feel validated. The shift in our dynamic was enough. I thought of my brother, stumbling in the shadow of his own lies, forced to confront his limitations without my intervention. I didn't feel triumph or schadenfreude, only a quiet satisfaction that life had corrected the imbalance without my needing to speak harsh words. Freedom revealed itself not as a loud proclamation, but as subtle, internal peace. I could move through the world without carrying the emotional debt of others' neglect. My work no longer defined my self-worth. My family's approval no longer determined my happiness. In that freedom, I found space to breathe deeply, to pursue interests and relationships without the constant background tension of having to prove my existence. It was strange, almost unfamiliar, to realize that the power I had sought through recognition had always been within me. Gratitude became part of my daily reflection. I was grateful for the betrayal, for the silence it forced upon me, and for the long period of observation that taught me the value of patience. I was grateful for the quiet victories that came without confrontation, and for the wisdom earned through restraint rather than impulse. In understanding these lessons, I saw that the entire journey from dismissal to recognition had been as much about discovering my own strength as it had been about exposing the weaknesses of others. I allowed myself moments of joy too, small celebrations of life no one else would notice. A walk in the park, a cup of tea without interruption, a quiet evening reading or listening to music. Simple pleasures, once ignored or overlooked, now felt profound. They were markers of my reclamation, proof that I could exist fully, uninterrupted by the dismissals that once defined me. Each of these moments became a meditation in autonomy, a reaffirmation that the world would no longer define my worth. And in that reflection, I finally understood the ultimate lesson. Peace does not come from forcing others to see your value. Peace comes from seeing it yourself, cultivating it silently, and living it without apology. In that truth, I was whole. I was free. I was undeniable. The final chapter of this story was not marked by confrontation or dramatic revelation. It was marked by a quiet certainty that I had never known before. I walked through my days with an ease that was unfamiliar, yet deeply earned. The weight of others' opinions, the sting of past betrayals, the constant struggle to prove my existence. All of it had dissolved into a calm that was unshakable. I no longer carried the burden of proving anything to anyone. My presence alone spoke volumes, and I no longer needed anyone to acknowledge it. At home, there was still distance, but it no longer hurt. My mother and brother, for all their flaws, had begun to navigate life without the assumption that I would carry them. Their struggles were theirs to face, just as my peace was mine to keep. I didn't revel in their discomfort. I simply recognized that life had finally balanced itself. I had done my part by stepping back, and now the world, in its quiet, inevitable way, had done the rest. In my work, the transformation had settled into permanence. I wasn't merely noticed. I was respected. My voice carried authority because it had always been grounded in competence, insight, and quiet observation. I could participate fully, without needing to dominate or defend myself. Colleagues turned to me for guidance, managers relied on my judgment, and yet I carried none of the stress that had once come from overextending myself. My control was complete, not because I forced it, but because I had allowed truth to assert itself over time. Perhaps the most profound change was internal. I had discovered the depth of my own resilience, the power of patience, and the strength of silent strategy. I no longer feared being invisible because I knew that my value was inherent, not granted. I no longer sought revenge in the traditional sense, because the quiet withdrawal and measured presence I had cultivated had achieved it in the most effective way possible. I had mastered the art of influence without assertion, of power without aggression, and in that mastery I found true liberation. I began to enjoy the world with a sense of lightness I hadn't felt in decades. Simple pleasures, a walk through the city streets, the laughter of friends, the quiet moments of solitude, took on new meaning. Every choice I made was grounded in my own desires and wisdom, not in the expectations or dismissals of others. I was finally fully myself, free, grounded, and unapologetically real. And so, the story ends, not with a dramatic confrontation, nor with loud declarations, but with a quiet certainty that echoes in every corner of my life. I had endured betrayal, orchestrated subtle justice, and emerged not only victorious but fundamentally changed. My peace was complete. My control was intact. My freedom was absolute. I had become undeniable, not through force, but through quiet, unassailable strength. And in that final stillness, I smiled, knowing that I had finally reclaimed everything that had ever been mine.